Ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking with author and academic Stephen Chavura. So you talked about how what we're seeing at the universities is a liberal bias. I do believe I heard a statistic out of America, in their institutions there in the universities, they have a situation where they have like 2 out of 23 professors are Republicans, registered Republicans, whereas the rest of them, 21 of them, are Democrats. I think it was in Pluckrose and Adams' a book where they actually made the point that what they do is when they're handing over the role to the next person in academia, they specifically look for people that represent their values. And so what ends up happening is this vicious cycle where it just gets more and more radical once it leans to one side. And so very quickly, over a few decades, you could have a completely different institution. And that's where we are right now. Now we've got, Harvard University, where they're basically racist in not allowing this. They put a cap on Asian students that go to the university, essentially, and I completely disagree with those strategies and what they've been doing, but we've your mutual friend, our mutual friend, John Anderson. He made the point that why aren't we seeing more people in the universities, professors, speaking up on this? If they're so knowledgeable on these issues, why? Because many of them, they do hold the same beliefs that you do, but they're not speaking up. What do you think that is?
Well, in America, there are a lot more conservatives in the universities. Although your stat is spot on, and there have been several studies done on ideology in American universities, and it literally is something like for every one Republican, there are 10 Democrats or very left-leaning lecturers. So your stat was actually spot on. Look, the problem is that people like to keep their jobs. People like to get promoted. People like to have a kind of collegial relationship with their colleagues, and that's why a lot of people don't stand up and call this out. It's precisely because they would literally be calling out their colleagues, because it's their colleagues who are the ones on selection committees of selecting who gets tenure in a department, who gets hired into the department. And it's in a sense their very colleagues who, quite frankly, are discriminating against conservatives. And that is just a fact. That in departments kind of like to get people in who think relatively similarly about the sorts of things that they research, because they like research and ideas to sort of complement one another. And consequently, there are certain things that if you put it in your CV and applied for a job in a university, if you, for example, put in a CV that you had an association with a conservative think tank, or maybe you wrote a book on conservatism from a sort of a sympathetic point of view, or you wrote a book criticizing a leftist take on something, whatever that is, that would pretty much automatically exclude you from being hired. And that's just the way it is. And this is the thing. The reason there are so few conservatives in the universities is not because conservatives are less intelligent or less curious than non-conservatives. It's because over 50 years, there has been a systemic program of basically getting rid of them. And you saw glimpses of it actually in the 1980s. Now the sort of the historian in me comes out. Many listeners here will be too young to remember this. In fact, I'm too young to remember it, but I was alive when it happened. It was in the mid-1980s when one of our greatest historians, Geoffrey Blainey, a legendary Australian historian, and by then he was in his 60s, he gave a speech at an RSL club, and the basic substance of his speech was Australia needs to be very careful about the rate of Asian immigration into Australia, because history tells us that if the rate of immigration from a very foreign culture is too great and it happens too quickly, it leads to social instability. I would consider that a fairly harmless, mild statement. Well, literally days after this speech, Joel, his colleagues in the Melbourne University History Department took out a full page in the Age newspaper, disassociating themselves from Jeffrey Blaney's views.
You're joking.
And from that day on, yeah, no, this is absolutely true. And from that day on, he was basically a pariah in his department. There were frequent interruptions of his lectures from protesting students. And look, a few years later, he basically left academia completely. He retired and just wanted nothing to do with it anymore. And that was an instance of real bullying that took place in the 1980s. We've seen similar things happen to Peter Ridd in Queensland. And I think Peter Ridd has come up with a great idea. Peter Ridd talks about what you need are kind of kamikaze professors. That is, professors and people who basically at the end of their careers who are really disturbed about what's taking place in the universities. What he says is what you need for them to do is to come out and say something that will really get them in trouble in the university. You know, nothing slanderous, nothing inciting or anything like that, but just something that they believe that would really get them in trouble in the universities and literally become martyrs to draw public attention to everything that's going on. Because I cannot tell you, Joel, how many retired academics and academics close to the end of their careers, they'll sort of mutter, oh, look where the universities are going, look at these diversity quotas, look at these diversity departments, it's all rubbish, but they will never say it publicly. And what you need is some of them to say it publicly towards the end of their careers, because look, you know something, financially, they're okay, they're going to be fine. But it draws attention to how, quite frankly, coercive and really brutal some of these university administrators and some academic colleagues can be, weeding out anyone who doesn't go along with sort of the leftist ideological agenda in universities, whether it's feminism, whether it's LGBT, any number of other sort of stances. And Marxism is still alive and well in universities. It's still there. And this is something that's taken place over the last 60 years. It certainly happened in Australia as well. A great book to read on that, and you only really need to read 1 or 2 chapters. It's Jim Franklin's book, Corrupting the Youth, A History of Philosophy in Australia. So if there's anyone here listening who's into a bit of history, for the Australian university situation, Jim Franklin's book, Corrupting the Youth, A History of Philosophy in Australia. Also, a book came out recently, a couple of things, Kevin Donnelly's book on cancel culture, and also a book edited by a professor at ANU, William Coleman, and it's called Campus Meltdown, and it's on the universities in Australia. So that gives you an insight into what's going on sort of on the Australian scene.
Yeah, no, I remember, there's a lot of examples of courage we've seen the last 2 years. And speaking to your point about some of the perhaps about to retire professors or university workers throwing a philosophical hand grenade that they've been holding onto for a while, we really saw that with you're welcome to use it. We really saw that during the last 2 years. I think of Graham Hood, who's of course, the Qantas pilot that blew up on social media and across US channels in America, where he was talking about the mandates and what was going on the last 2 years with the pandemic. And he ended up speaking up because he was near the end of his career. He needed the work. He absolutely needed the money, but he put it all on the line. And he said, no, you know what? There's a lot of these younger pilots here. This is going to affect them. This is going to affect their health. This might, make our flights less safe. If we have a pilot that has an episode while in the plane, possibly due to these jabs, this could be very bad for society. And so he chose to be that person to go down and clear the path. And it reminds me of what Douglas Murray says in one of his books. He describes how the military has this weapon called the Viper, which is it's not an aggressive sort of weapon. What it does is when you've got a minefield, you would send this sort of truck out there and it would shoot these big wires out, which would have these grenades to the lines, and it would go across this minefield and it would detonate and clear a path, which would allow for vehicles, tanks, troops to travel through the minefield safely because it's detonated all of the obstructions. And that's what happens when people speak up. It's not easy being the first one, but once they speak up, there's a greater chance that the next person speaks up. And once they speak up, there's an even greater chance that the third person speaks up. And so that's what we've been seeing the last 2 years. And we've been seeing, that with a lot of different things. Now, let's move to Gigi Foster, because I think she's an example of a very phenomenal economist in her courage and conviction in calling this out. She recently came out with a report looking at the effects of the lockdowns, and I haven't had a chance to look at this. I'm looking forward to seeing more about it after the show. But what did she say in it?
Yeah, look, Gigi Foster, an incredible woman, brave woman. She's a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales Business School, and she and a colleague of hers, Paul Freiters or Paul Frieters, I've probably mispronounced his name. Dutch names are difficult to pronounce for me. They put out a couple of reports. There's sort of a short one, and then there's a long one, and both of these are available for free online. And the short one is simply called "Do Lockdowns and Border Closures Serve the Greater Good?" A cost-benefit analysis. And this was put out under the name of Gigi Foster. And it's just mind-blowing. Gigi Foster, and by the way, I should say, they also wrote a book last year. They co-wrote a book with another fellow named Michael Baker. I don't know if this will come out backwards. Oh, there we go. That's good. The writing's coming out good. The Great COVID Panic. This is a very good book. But let me tell you, if you just really want the bare essentials of what this book says, then track down these discussion papers by Gigi Foster. Again, they're all free, and what they say is just completely contrary to the message that we got from the mainstream media and academics over the last 2 years. In fact, one of the big aspects of this particular report, here it is, is how Australian economists and economists the world over basically refuse to tell the truth about the very likely devastating economic impacts that the lockdowns were going to have. And they were really disappointed in their fellow economists for doing that. And they basically said that what overtook the universities is, quote, an enormous groupthink taking place on the one hand, and on the other hand, the dissenters dare not speak out. And we definitely saw that in Australia, where, as you know, Joel, those who wanted to critique the lockdown policies and the mandates, they were just few and far between. Even in the conservative media, like at Sky News, how often did you hear any Sky News anchor criticizing the mandates? I can't remember hearing it once. There was occasional criticisms of the lockdowns because that was sort of an economic issue and they liked that sort of thing. But in terms of critiquing the mandates or even critiquing the sort of the effectiveness and the safety of the and the behavior of APRA in all of this, you just would not hear a peep out of any of that from the conservative media for the most part. So even the conservative mainstream media totally dropped the ball on a lot of this, which is why it was so good that we had the alternative media, obviously guys like you, Joel, and several others as well. But basically what these reports from Gigi Foster argue is that the costs of the lockdown policies during the lockdowns were absolutely dwarfed any benefits. And that was one thing that people never spoke about. People always said that the conversation was always, what are the benefits of lockdowns? What are the benefits of lockdowns? And the answer was basically two things. Fewer people are going to get COVID and the hospital systems won't get overrun. Now, the extent to which both of those are true, as pointed out in these reports, is highly debatable. It's highly debatable that Australia would have gone through some kind of COVID apocalypse if it didn't shut down the way it did. And basically, what they point out in one of their reports is that they say that there were 50 studies carried out of other countries around the world that did have really serious lockdowns. Here we go. Is this it? Yeah. I'm just trying to find, and they basically said there's actually very little evidence that the lockdowns had much of an impact on how many people wound up getting COVID. And apparently, prior to the COVID coming, the general consensus, a view that was not controversial, was that most viruses are not stopped with border closures. And they're not stopped with lockdowns. The only way to stop a virus through border closures and lockdowns is literally to stop the first person with the virus coming in, and then the second, and then the third. You literally have to keep it out of the country, because once it comes into the country, it will spread. And that is, of course, what we experienced in Australia, and what was experienced all around the world. Even though all these draconian lockdowns took place, the virus still spread. And now what they're saying now is what may be the case, and you've probably been reading about this, is that there's this latest variant of the virus is hitting us when we have never been more susceptible to viruses, because basically over the last 2 years, it would seem that people have become weakened by not getting the usual colds and flus that they normally would have got over the last 2 years. So in actual fact, our immune systems have become even weaker, which may be causing this latest virus to be particularly nasty for certain people. So this is just more of sort of the law of unintended consequences. But basically, Gigi Foster in this report says all sorts of incredible things. And the report itself, there's a short version, which is literally only 8 pages long. And I would definitely encourage you to read it. She says, no scholarly works published after World War II and prior to 2020 argue that restrictions on the movements of healthy populations would result or ever have resulted in positive net benefits in terms of human welfare, well-being, or human lives. And, you know, the report goes on to say that in actual fact, probably the Australian government overreacted hundreds of times over to what the actual appropriate response to COVID should have been. And she goes through all the figures, and she goes through some quite detailed analysis to basically say that the lockdown in Australia was a vast overreaction, and the benefits will be way, way outweighed by the costs. In fact, there's a paragraph here just on the costs. She sort of says imposing crippling restrictions on 99% of the population will necessarily cause significant overall harm. Evidence from numerous cost-benefit analyses undertaken across the world has already indicated for many countries that lockdowns are damaging, and even that they do not on net save lives. Lockdowns and social distancing measures inflict unemployment, business collapse, education, neglect, health neglect, and loneliness. The virus does not do these things. Government directives do these things. The report is absolutely damning. And I thought it was actually really a really salient thing to talk about today, because you posted recently, Joel, that it's sort of the 1 year anniversary of that protest that you and I attended in the city. As it turns out, was not an authorized protest.
Yeah,
and that was an anti-lockdown protest.
Yeah.
And I mean, do you remember how Australians behaved that day, Joel? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was absolutely, it was mostly peaceful. There was a lot of clashes between people and police, but it was unclear who actually started a lot of those scuffles. I did upload a video of that particular day, and yeah, look, it was a wild day. There was a lot of angst amongst it. The protest was organized by the Global Freedom Rally group, which is, I think, a German-based group, and they had an Australian organizer, but it was very organic. I mean, the way that it came together was quite astonishing. It was really amazing to see so many people completely unscripted come together and basically, share their disdain. And I'll show you some images of what actually happened, but basically showing their disdain of the government. They were not very happy at all. I happened to be there. I was covering the whole situation and seeing exactly what happened. But yeah, I mean, you were there. What did you see?
Well, I mean, I saw largely. I personally didn't see any scuffles, although there were some very, very early on.
Mm.
Um, but basically, it was completely peaceful. What I saw, but what really shocked me on the day was the police media driven campaign to dob people in who were recognizably at the protest. I was just shocked at how so many Australians had been overcome with just sheer fear and divisiveness, even though health experts had said months previously that it doesn't spread outdoors. It's really an indoor spreading disease. That was sort of well known, and yet there's the footage. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, it was a wild day. I will not forget that day. I vividly remember aspects of it and being very wired after it. But yeah, it was interesting. I did end up on the steps that day, and I tried to summarize what people's concerns were that day. But they were very angry at the lockdowns. The context at the time was that, you know, people, they did not like the fact that the government had locked the construction industry down. They didn't like the fact that these mandates were coming in and you had to be jabbed in order to work. I do believe we were at first, we're about 30% first dose of the jab. And yeah, you know, it was insane to see that. And, you know, like we were calling it Freedom Day at the time, or the people that were there were calling it Freedom Day. And yeah, we saw an eclectic group of people, every religion, every creed,
Yeah.
tens of thousands of them, I think. And it was insane to see exactly that peace and harmony of people coming together and demonstrating their Australian right. And they're literally they're wielding the Australian flag. I mean, you know, who would have thought that their own government would be coming after them? I mean, the government's going after people with their own flag. But yeah,
Well,
look, it was amazing.
Not just our own government, but our own fellow citizens. I
Mm,
mean, that was, to me, that was the remarkable thing about that day. The glee and fervor with which citizens were just wishing ill upon the citizens that had gone into the city to protest that day. One thing I noticed that day is that most of the people seemed to be from the western suburbs. You could just
mm,
tell they were from the western suburbs.
yeah.
They were wearing their, you know, their fluoro tops. A lot of them were clearly from sort of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern areas. I mean, I grew up in Bankstown, so I know what I'm talking about when I talk about the western suburbs. And what Foster and Frieders point out in this report is that these lockdowns disproportionately affect those very people. So, and here's something like just talking about the schools shutting down. This is what they have to say in the report. Children of well-organized and digitally skilled parents have seen few negative consequences from the lockdowns, but children of disadvantaged groups with relatively poor preparation have seen a lot of damage to their educational progress, sometimes even including regression in cognitive levels as a result of the lack of intellectual stimulus. And the same could be said for just the economic impacts of the lockdowns, where a lot of people are able to just keep working because they're laptop Zoom workers, whereas others, obviously in the construction industry, tradespeople, they basically lost their livelihoods and were put on unemployment for months on end, which had, again, the whole thing had a disproportionately negative impact on those who were least able to absorb the impact of an economic lockdown. And that was one of the things that just disgusted me so much about so many Australians who all they saw when they saw these people are just spreading a disease. Even though from memory, I don't even think there was one case of COVID subsequently traced back to that particular protest. I remember watching the news for weeks afterwards, and at best they said there might have been one. And believe me, if they could come up with a few, they would have said it.
Yeah.
But the total lack of empathy for their fellow Australians who are really doing it tough in this lockdown absolutely shocked me. And I've said this before, Joel, that as a historian, I mean, people nowadays talk about mass formation psychosis, and that's a very controversial term. But you don't need that term to know that historically, people can go into a kind of can sort of be whipped up into a frenzy by politicians, by the media, and by fellow citizens at the right time. It happened during World War One. And in World War One, anyone who questioned the war or didn't want to go to war, they were basically demonized as cowards, traitors. They were socially ostracized. Some people were locked up for no good reason because they might be traitors. And there are all sorts of other things that happened. Newspapers were censored. So the true death figures, the true death toll of the war were not being reported back to Australians because that might disincentivize people from signing up and fighting. For me, the Australian experience during World War One is the perfect analogy for what happened in Australia and probably around the West over the last 2 years with COVID. We just became hysterical. And it's 2 years later, that reports are starting to come out. So, the Gigi Foster report and others, the reports will start coming out, pointing out what people were saying right from the very beginning. Experts like John Ioannidis at Stanford University, Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, people at Oxford pointing out that these lockdowns are unnecessary and they're going to probably cause more harm than benefits. The reports are now coming out, and the people who at the time said it and were demonized are going to be vindicated.
Absolutely. And I think that that leads into a lot of different points, because this expert class really have stuffed up. The cost of lockdown, we're not going to be able to calculate that for some time. A lot of people, they wanted answers yesterday. We still don't know the full damage from these lockdowns. I mean, there are kids which they're in kindergarten, or they're in year 1 or year 2 now. When they are in year 12 and we see a noticeable drop in the HSC results, we will be like, that was the lockdown generation. Like, it's gonna. I don't think people understand how bad this is. I didn't have to deal with this crap when I was doing my HSC. I didn't have to. It was hard enough as it was to work out who you are, where you're going, which, you're meant to have all these answers, and to add lockdowns on top of that. I mean, my heart went out to those kids. And you know what? Those kids will remember what the government did. And you know what? The government, just as they tried indoctrinating for over a decade about a lot of the history about Australia and how Australia is racist, in similar fashion, these lockdowns just gave them the best libertarian education anyone could ask for. So I'm really hoping that that ends up coming through. But I'm hoping that they are able to catch up on the studies that they really need, like having solid mathematical, English, and public speaking skills, and well-rounded individuals, and very cultured with different music and everything, so that they can be robust members of society.
Look, and not just the educational aspect that needs to be properly measured, but again, the Foster and Frida's report mentions that on page 16, a UK government, this is a government report from the UK, from the Department of Health and Social Care, a UK government report concluded that the likely number in the UK was an additional loss of 100,000 preventable deaths via undiagnosed cancers and similar preventable problems. So in the UK, the government itself has released a report suggesting that there may have been 100,000 people who died in the UK because their cancer wasn't diagnosed and other problems that they were facing were not diagnosed, because the whole hospital system became geared towards treating this COVID epidemic. I mean, that is just unbelievable. I mean, they basically say in this report, I'll paraphrase it, but they say that the COVID lockdowns in Australia are the greatest policy blunder in Australian history. And I think that COVID lockdowns will go down as the greatest policy blunders, certainly of the last 100 years in the West. An incredible overreaction, and it needs to be exposed. There needs in Australia, if not a royal commission, an inquiry, at the very least, a serious cost-benefit analysis. And there cannot not be one, because this was the most radical state intervention into the economy, into businesses, into people's lives, into the education system, into the health system ever in our history. not even more radical since World War II. And in World War II, prices were fixed by the government. In World War II, there was rationing. The Labour government tried to bring in socialism during and after World War II. What happened then was nothing in comparison to what happened in Australia over the last 2 years. There needs to be a cost-benefit analysis. And I actually really think that there needs to be a serious inquiry into AHPRA. AHPRA, the Health Commission, which was basically responsible for telling doctors that they would be investigated if they said anything to patients that might inhibit the rollout. And maybe to finish on this topic, Joel, I don't know, but all the time now, as you know, there are literally 15,000 cases of COVID in Australia right now. It's just ridiculous. There are about 15,000 cases, and now everyone's basically saying, you get COVID and you wind up in hospital. They'll give you all these antivirals and things like that to treat it. So everyone knows now that there are ways of treating COVID that don't require the. And yet we know also that doctors were threatened with their livelihoods very early on and well into the rollout, that if someone basically came to them and said, look, I don't want to take the, what else can you prescribe for me? What's another thing I can do to avoid the worst consequences of COVID? They knew that if they said, you can take all of these different antivirals, they knew that they could become under investigation for doing that from AHPRA. AHPRA literally gagged doctors from giving people beneficial health advice. There needs to be an investigation into AHPRA, 100%.
Absolutely. And you know what? There weren't enough people that's really stood up at the time. And unfortunately, we got there in the end. We can no one wants to really admit it, that lockdowns were bad in the government, because they all cheered it on at the time. There were very few people that didn't cheer it on. But yeah, look, that seems to be the trend we're seeing in society right now. It's the fact that generally we are a society of cowards that don't know where we come from. We don't know what we stand for. And therefore, we're willing to believe in anything and also be pushed over by a government. I remember talking to my mum during the lockdown, and I said, Mum, what would your dad be saying if he was still here, God rest his soul? He would be saying, screw the government, I'm going to pick up the phone, I'm going to call my local MP and say, what the hell is going on, basically, because they were just a different breed back then. And by the way, he would have said that in Arabic. He would have been very angry. And I just think that, it's just, we have softened up as a society. And I don't think it's surprising that they had to lock down southwestern Sydney. Don't get me wrong, I have no doubt the virus would have, spread more in communities where we greet each other with a kiss. But the point must be made, they targeted the 12 LGAs of concern, also happened to be the same areas that voted no on the same-sex marriage vote. Why? Because we have a very high immigration population and a very strong connection still with our religion, whatever that may be, from the Middle East. And so a lot of people are very unhappy. And so that's why I think we saw so many people come out on the 24th of July, a lot of very angry men from the construction industry and other industries. There were some people that got the jab and they were there out protesting. They were very angry. They said, I complied, I did everything, But talking
that was another amazing thing, Joel, that people who had the jab were still kept locked up purely to put pressure on those who didn't have the jab to go and get it. And I remember people like Claire Lehman, who's usually sort of level-headed, but on the COVID issue, she just went off the charts. Pro-propaganda, pro-fearmongering. She literally tweeted, the unvaxxed are effing burdens. That's a quote from her. She accused people who are basically keeping everyone else locked up. For such a clever woman, it didn't occur to her that maybe the person to blame for her being locked up, even though while she was, and this is so many others as well, that maybe the person, the institution to blame is the government for keeping healthy people locked up, purely as a kind of pressure mechanism to put on those who weren't interested in taking the. But even intelligent people who would very often have a very skeptical view of what the government does just lost their minds during the whole COVID pandemic. And another great book on that is this one. This is a brilliant book by Laura. What's the name again? Laura Dodsworth, State of Fear, and it deals with what happened in the UK, and it basically works for Australia as well. Another
Yeah.
fantastic book.
Yeah, the UK
Anyhow.
had a lot of really good stats that came out about the pandemic and what the first round of the lockdown was going to cause and how many people were going to die because they didn't have their cancer checkups. It was amazing, the stats that were coming out there from the NHS. But
Yeah, we got nothing.
But moving forward, I did want to look at this last topic to finish the podcast. I can't believe See, this is our problem, Dr. Chavura. We just 40 minutes goes like that with us. This story out from news.com basically made the point that 7 Manly Sea Eagles players may stand down over the club's pride jersey, and that's a post by Martin Isles where he said, "In today's world, Christians who seek to live for God have to be ready and willing to stand apart, counting the cost and considering it a part of normal life like Daniel did. When the days become evil, you will be able to stand your ground and have done everything to stand." And that's from Ephesians 6:13. He said, "Pray for these men." And he said, "P.S. fellas, if you're having a hard time, I know a few good lawyers with a successful track record in the very matter, funnily enough." Sportsman, deja vu. That's really funny because he's obviously alluding to the Israel Folau situation. What's your thoughts on that situation?
This whole thing, what it really shows is that the modern LGBT rights movement is not really a rights movement. I mean, a rights movement is a movement that says, look, there are these people who should be allowed to do something they're currently not allowed to do. Could we allow them to do it? And if we allow them to do it, then that's all we're asking. That is fine. That's what a rights movement is. The LGBT movement is not that. It's almost a kind of I don't want to use the word religion, but it is a kind of cult that is sort of trying to dominate all institutions, all minds, to get everyone to think the same way about LGBT issues. And this is just the latest example of it in Australia. For example, this is what I mean. So the club that's making their players wear this pride rainbow jersey is the Manly Sea Eagles. Now, the Manly Sea Eagles want to be known as the most inclusive club in Australia. Okay, fine. All right. So why isn't it enough? Why isn't it enough if you want to be the most inclusive club in Australia? Why isn't it enough just not to discriminate against LGBT players? If someone says that they're gay and they're on the team, don't fire them, don't persecute them, don't make a big deal about it. Why isn't that enough? But it's not enough because this isn't really about being just inclusive, and it's not just about rights. It's about forcing everyone to think the same way. It really is kind of, it is an ideology that is coming into society. It's kind of taking the place of what Christianity used to have in society. It's interesting that in the last census that came out, self-identified Christians have fallen to 44% in Australia. Now, so obviously Christianity is socially in decline in Australia, but does that mean that nothing is taking its place? Does that mean that Australia is becoming less religious than what it was, say, 50 years ago? I don't think so. I actually think it's just as religious as it's always been. It's just a new religion is coming in, or at least a new ideology is coming in to take the place, and that is the LGBT sort of juggernaut. And so what you have is essentially a bullying campaign in the Manly Sea Eagles to force players to wear a symbol, a sign that in actual fact they have a conscientious religious objection to. They were never consulted about this. It's basically just expected that they will do it. Now, it seems that players are right now being allowed to not play with the jersey, but they have to not play. They can't play with another jersey. It's either wear the jersey or don't play. It wouldn't surprise me that once enough players are basically agree to wear the jersey, and it's only maybe one or two who are just saying, oh, I don't want to use it, then they'll start saying, no, you have to wear the jersey if you're going to be a part of this team. And if you don't want to wear it, then you can't be a part of the team anymore. And so this is just part of a bigger movement that's sweeping Australia. And it's very much sweeping the West. This sort of LGBT movement, which is out to basically erase any trace in our society of people who hold to traditional views of man-woman marriage, traditional views of sexual ethics, and traditional views of male-female sex and gender, binary gender, and that kind of thing. This is all about trying to sweep all of that away. And it's interesting that the Manly Sea Eagles have signed up to an organisation called ACON, or the AIDS Council of New South Wales. And ACON basically goes to organisations, universities, sporting teams, others, and encourages them to sign up to sort of diversity programs. And so this is actually bigger than just football. This is big organizations who are trying to ideologically infiltrate all corporations to get them to sign up to ideological statements and beliefs. And those employees within them who don't want to go along with it, well, they will be punished. It is kind of like a Chinese social credit system for corporations. And that's in a sense where we're all heading. This is just sort of one aspect of it. It'll happen for sustainability. It'll happen for other things as well. This is sort of the path down which we're headed. And I was delighted to see that, 7 players said that they're not going to wear it. That's courage culture. And that's the only way to really fight this. You just need people to stand up and say, we're not going to go along with this. You have no right to tell us to wear things that are against our conscience, that are against our religion, which really have nothing to do with me being an effective football player. And that's the only way that this can possibly stop. People standing up and being courageous. And as you said to me the other day, Joel, courage is contagious. Courage gives other people permission to be courageous. And that's what we need a lot more of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an amazing story to finish on, because that is what this is all about. It's about sharing those amazing stories so that you guys can hear all about it. So if you're tuning in now, give this a share, get it out there. I love having these discussions with Dr. Chavura. We might make this a regular thing. So if you want to see more of this, remember, give this a share, get it out there. If you want more of specifically Dr. Chavura, you can find him on Instagram. I love his account and his posts there at Stephen Chavura1, and he's also on Facebook as Stephen Chavura. You're also on TikTok. Is that the same as Facebook, Stephen Chavura? Or
yes, TikTok, Stephen Chavura, and Telegram as well, Stephen Chavura. The only one that's not Stephen Chavura is just Instagram, where there's just a numeral 1 at the end. But yeah, I'm easy to find.
Absolutely. Let's see if we can build those accounts back up, guys. But I love these chats. I really do enjoy having them with you. I can't wait to see what's in store for yourself and what you're writing next week. And maybe next week we'll tune in to have another chat.
Thanks a lot, Joel. Always fantastic talking with you.
Awesome. If you're tuning in right now, thank you guys. Remember to give it a like, give it a share. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to support the show, please remember you can donate at PayPal, who I cannot wait to leave. But for now, I'm getting donations from you guys from PayPal. So www.tpost with a T at the end, .com.au/donate. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you later in the next one.